everybody. Jeff Jones here. Welcome to the weekly Chase Oaks Church podcast. Before we dive in, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and download the Chase Oaks Church app. The app is the best place to catch up on messages, engage with our community, and stay in the loop with everything going on around here. Most importantly, my hope is that today's message inspires you to take your next step in your faith journey. Here we go.
Well, hello there. Welcome to Chase Oaks. My name is Eric. I'm one of the pastors here on staff. It is so great to be with you. Oh, man, claps. Oh, my gosh. All right. Thank you. Man, you guys are too kind. You're just trying to pump me up with joy because we're talking about joy today. So when I saw the design and the name of this series, we're calling it Fruitful. We have all those fruit stickers on there. It reminded me of my first job all the way back at the beginning of high school where I worked at a smoothie shop called Juice Stop. And I remember you'd get behind the counter of the juice stop, and there would be all these different compartments with the frozen fruit options that are all listed out. Then they'd have, all the different ice cream options and juice options. And so one of the perks of the job is that you could kind of go down the line and play with whatever combinations you would want for your smoothie. And with that, a whole new world was opened up to me because they had this tray of supplemental add-ons that you could put inside the smoothie. Things like echinacea, fiber, energy boosters, protein powder. I had never heard of any of these things before. And I was so curious about them. And then they even had this little section on the side where they would grow grass. They called it wheatgrass. And you could blend it up and turn it into a shot of juice that looked super intriguing to me. So I was curious to try it. And then one of my coworkers said, you know what? If you take that shot of wheatgrass, it's like taking Drano for your system. And I was like, I'm not into that. But the other stuff, I really was. I mean, this might be hard to imagine in the beginning of high school, I was this really thin, kind of skinny, kid. And so when I looked at all these supplements, I was like, well, who wouldn't want more of these things? Sure, I want to fight colds and stuff. That's great. Energy would be great. But when I got to the protein powder, I don't know what I had in my head, but maybe it'd be like, Popeye and muscles would pop up as soon as you put. So I would put like a double scoop, and I would just pile in all these nutrients. And do you want to know what would happen? Nothing. Like a whole lot of nothing. The only thing that caused me to bulk up later on was turning 40 and having 3 kids. And it wasn't the muscle bulk that came out of there. But I love that image for this series because as we're talking about, the fruit of the Spirit, what everybody came into that smoothie shop looking for was they wanted that smoothie to do something in them. Like it could be that they wanted that smoothie to give them that refreshing snack or that boost of energy. It could be that they were trying to fight a cold, or I don't know, maybe they needed Drano for their system. I don't know if that was their story or not, but they wanted an infusion of something in their life. And when we're talking about the fruit of the Spirit, these are characteristics like love and peace and patience and gentleness, things that our world desperately wants, things that all of us would love to have more in our life, and yet they can be so hard for us to generate on our own. And so especially today as we're talking about joy, I know that all of us, if we went to a smoothie shop right now and they had joy listed as one of the supplemental add-ons that we could put in, we would add a double scooping right away. And we would pay a lot of money for that because this world has a way of zapping us of our joy. We can know when we've lost it. It can be hard for us to generate on our own. It can even be difficult to define what joy is. Like if you were to try to put words into your head about how you would define joy, like what would come to mind? I mean, is it intense happiness? Is it an emotional high? Is it a zen-like peace, while the world is burning up all around you and you just kind of have a Mona Lisa face on you? Is that what joy is? As hard as it is to define, it can even be harder for us to find it. And sometimes it can feel like joy has even been mislabeled. Growing up in church, I remember we sang a song where you would go, I've got that joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Yeah, a few church people out there said the right line after that, where. And I remember being at church and I'd look over and I'd see kind of some older people who were a little grumpy. And they were singing that song, and I was looking at them like, okay, so either one of two things is true. Either your definition of joy is different than mine, or that joy is like way, way down there in there, and we got to figure out where that is. And perhaps that's why, when it comes to joy, God has a bit of a reputation for being a killjoy. You know, because maybe for you, you can think of an overly religious person in your life who just had a habit of, and there's no other nice way to say it, just had a habit of kind of sucking the joy out of the room as soon as they entered in. You know, there's a show on TV that's called What We Do in the Shadows. This is a show that is kind of a dry humor, funny take on vampires, a modern day group of vampires that live in Staten Island. Now, I've only seen a snippet or two of this show. I'm not here to endorse it. You might love it, you might hate it, I don't really know. But the one scene that I saw, I found hilarious. And they were talking about this character. They introduced this character named Colin. And let's pop Colin up on the screen. Colin doesn't look like your normal kind of vampire because he isn't your normal kind of vampire. You know, most vampires, they want to, feed on the blood of humans, but not Colin. The way that Colin feeds is he drains humans of their energy. And the way that he does that is often at work through things like reply all emails or small talk at the water cooler. He especially loves to go to city council meetings where he likes to talk about zoning ordinances and why they need to change. He feels really full after that. And they would say in the show that an energy vampire, which is what Colin is, they say an energy vampire is the most common type of vampire that there is, that you may even work with one. And if you don't know who that is, it may be, you know where I'm going with that, right? It might be you, but it might be me as well. And so with that, I think in our culture, there's a narrative that God is a bit of a joy vampire. Like, maybe we wouldn't say it that harshly. We would say, okay, maybe he's not out to kill joy, but maybe we would say, okay, the kind of joy that God is after is not the fun kind of joy. It's the pious, sitting in a church pew kind of joy. It's not the happiness or fun kind of joy that most of us would think of when we think of joy. For him, maybe we think that he's gonna zap that out and drain it from the room. And I hope what we'll discover today is that narrative couldn't be further from the truth. There's an author, his name is John Ortberg. He wrote this that is really profound. He says, "We do not understand God if we do not understand this about him, that God is the happiest being in the universe." Now, perhaps for you, like me, when I first heard that statement, it kind of raised some red flags. I was like, is that really true? Is that really the way to put that? I'm not sure if I would use those words exactly like he did. But if it is true, and we're going to put this statement to the test today, if it is true, it changes everything about how we define joy and how you and I go about receiving more joy in our life. And if you're like me, this weekend, I could use a joy smoothie in my life. That there's some places where a fresh infusion should be great. And so I think as we explore this statement, as we explore if God really is the happiest being in the universe, that I think this will help us experience joy. And so for us to go about testing that statement, I want us to look at a moment from Jesus' ministry. And the reason why we're going to look at Jesus is that in his ministry, Jesus said that if you want to know the Father, all we have to do is look at him. That Jesus is the clearest picture that we get of the heart of Father. And so in this early moment in Jesus' ministry, we're going to see the very first miracle that he ever did in his ministry, at least the first recorded one that we have there. And first of anything is really significant. I mean, you have first steps. We record those first words. We try to coach our kids to say our name in that. And first miracles are really important too, and especially in Jesus' case. So join me in John chapter 2. This is in chapter 1. Again, you can follow me on the screens if you don't have a Bible. And this is what it says. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So this is most likely a wedding of a family friend because Jesus' mom is there, Jesus is there, And Jesus also had a few of his followers there as well. And these followers had literally just started following Jesus. We know this, it was just 3 days ago. That's why it says on the third day. So 3 days earlier, he invites a bunch of random dudes to start following him. And all of a sudden, they're invited. They're his plus ones at a wedding. Could you imagine the bride's reaction to that? Like, really? Like, for those of us that are married, did you ever have any random plus ones that showed up at your wedding? I did. So I had a relative, a distant relative. I didn't know. I barely knew this relative. And she brought a plus one. And all I knew about this plus one was that his name was Bob. That's it. I don't know Bob's last name. I don't know anything of his story. I remember that we were trying to, kind of cut and cull the list of who all could be there. And somehow Bob showed up at my wedding. And maybe you had a Bob or two as well. So Jesus' new disciples show up too. But in this culture, that wasn't really all that strange. I mean, weddings were huge community affairs. People from all over would be invited in from the community to celebrate with the bride and with the groom. And they would have a ton of preparation that they would need to do in order to pull off this wedding. A lot of supplies, a lot of planning, a lot of food, a lot of drinks. And so at this particular wedding, a crisis starts to emerge because the family starts to run out of supplies. Let's check it out. Continuing on. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, this is pretty obvious, they have no more wine. In an honor and shame culture, this would have been a huge embarrassment for the family. But apparently at this moment, only a few people know about the predicament. Mary does, a few of the servants in the back, now Jesus does as well. And so Mary is trying to help them save face in the middle of this crisis. And so she turns to Jesus. Now, in this moment, Jesus hadn't yet done any big miracle, at least nothing that had been recorded. So we don't know exactly what she was expecting here. I mean, she must have known that Jesus was special and angels had shown up at his birth and she knew some special things were in store for Jesus, and he probably proved to be pretty resourceful as a kid. So she does what only a mother could do and kind of makes a statement, but she makes a statement with her eyes that's saying, they have no more wine, as in, do something about it. And so she tells that to Jesus, and Jesus' response, he initially seems to dismiss her. This is what he says. Woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied. Now, let me give a bit of pastoral advice here for a second. In that culture, the term woman was endearing, was polite, was tender. I mean, just context here, Jesus at the cross later on would look at Mary and say, woman, behold your son. So there's a tenderness that actually is in this phrase. That was in that culture. In our culture, if you're a guy and you use woman with the ladies in your life, you better think twice, or pretty much don't think twice about it. Just don't do it. Walk away with that tonight if you don't walk away with anything else. Jesus replied after he asked that question, why do you involve me? He says, my hour has not yet come. And when Jesus is talking about hour, he does this throughout the Gospel of John, that it refers to what Jesus ultimately came to do, his big purpose, that as he came and as he's unfolding his public ministry, he knew where it led, that it led to the cross, where he would die and pay for the sins of the world. And so what Jesus is tenderly asking Mary at this moment when he's saying, why do you involve me? He's saying, for what purpose are you asking me to do this? I mean, our purposes may not be as aligned as you think. That for Mary, what she's thinking is how to save face at this wedding. What Jesus is thinking is he's thinking in terms of what God has called him to do, and does this fit in with that purpose? What's cool is that he does act, which means it actually does fit in with his purpose, and we'll see how that plays out. Continuing on. His mother said to the servants, I love that there's no conversation. He just is like, hey, he's going to still do it. And so he says, his mother says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw out some and take it to the master of the banquet. And they did so. And imagine if you're one of those servants there. I don't know when the water was miraculously turned to wine, which is going to happen, but maybe it happened already. Maybe they didn't know. I'm imagining as a servant, they're lugging all this, liquid in there, and they're like, I wonder what's going to happen here. And they probably had the same question. So they took it to the master of the banquet, and he tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and he said, dude, he didn't say dude, but I kind of hear him saying dude because listen what he says, dude, everyone brings out the choice wine first. Basically the best stuff from the cellar, they bring that out first. And then when everyone's had a little bit too much to drink, they bring the cheaper wine after that. Basically the boxed stuff. But you have saved the best till now. And what Jesus did here in Cana, this is John giving us context. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. That is, John is telling us this is the first miracle that Jesus would do. And the way that what he does with that first miracle is he saves the day. Literally, he saves a party, which defies expectations in so many different ways. For one, the location of this first miracle is so surprising, particularly if you were back then and you were waiting on the Messiah like many of the Jewish people were doing, that they would have expected that if God was going to do some amazing miracle, if he was going to reveal himself in a powerful way, basically, if the Messiah was going to come and launch out his campaign to start to bring back glory to Israel, that the place that would happen where it was the center of God's work in the world, or so they thought. That it would have happened in the temple in Jerusalem, in the middle of some religious ceremony, some religious ritual. But instead, where Jesus decides to do his first miracle is in a small town, far away from the temple, in the midst of everyday life, in the middle of a party. Think about that. I think Christians in particular, those of us that have grown up in the church, we tend to over-spiritualize joy so much that almost as if the kind of joy that God wants each of us to experience can really only be experienced like here at a church service or in the flow of some kind of worship moment. Or sometimes we tend to think of joy that maybe what God most wants from us is to become monks who separate out and pull back from ordinary life and kind of turn their head at regular pleasures of everyday living. And what Jesus does in this moment is he tells us and he shows us that he wants to infuse your everyday life with joy. Joy in the middle of your workplace. Joy in the middle of a hospital room. Joy at home, joy at a kid's soccer game, joy at school, joy in the middle of life's festivities and life's parties. Everyday kind of joy. And that's another way that this, story defies expectations too, is the fact that Jesus is actually at a party. During the 19th and 20th centuries, at the height of the temperance movement where, prohibition was happening, Bible teachers at that time jumped through so many different hoops to try to explain away how Jesus could be involved at a party, let alone drink. Like they just couldn't fathom it, like that Jesus would drink alcohol, let alone make alcohol at a party. In fact, the background story for Welch's grape juice is that they were trying to invent non-alcoholic wine because they're like, well, there's no way that Christians are supposed to drink alcohol. And in their mind, they just didn't think it was possible that God would be involved. So many of the teachers at that time said that, well, they were serving regular wine during the actual party, but the wine that Jesus made was actually unfermented grape juice. It's almost as if God was going to create wine, he would do it in a way where there wasn't any of that yucky alcoholic stuff that's in there. And that if God, in their narrative, was going to do anything at that party, it wasn't that he was going to turn water into wine. It was that he was going to turn wine into water and say, I'll show you. Let me zap the fun right out of this party. And that's part of such a larger narrative that can be very problematic. That God is somehow against pleasurable things in life. And yet when you think about it and you kind of look at the world that we live in, it couldn't be further from the truth. That God has infused his joy everywhere. And that we have so many things that all we have to simply do is notice it and see it. Like, for example, the sunrise. Like, God didn't have to make that beautiful, but he did. The way that Psalm 19 talks about it, it compares the sun to a champion coming out victorious every morning, rejoicing and celebrating because of God's goodness. That's how it describes the sun coming into the world. Or think about something like food. You and I have somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 taste buds in our mouth. Part of the reason being that God designed us to be able to delight in the good things of his creation. Or think about something like sex. It was God's idea. It's not like he's like up in heaven looking down like, I can't believe what they decided to do. And then sheepishly looks away. No, it was his idea, and he designed it with the proper context, marriage, so that not to give us rules that would kind of bind us and hold us down, but because he wants us to experience the greatest amount of joy that we can through his good gifts. And that also includes something like wine. The Bible is not anti-drinking. It is anti-getting drunk. And there are great reasons not to drink. I know people that do that for health reasons or family history reasons or personal history reasons. And there are great reasons to be wise with that so that we don't get off track of what God wants for us. But at this party, Jesus not only drank wine, he made wine. And he made a lot of it. If my math is correct, and pastors are terrible at math, but if my math is correct, he made about 180 gallons of wine. And not only was it the quantity that he made, the quality of what he made was the best of the best. Why? And it's because he wanted to point to his bigger purposes. He wanted to point to who he is and what he came to bring. And I don't think the disciples got this at this moment, but later on, I bet it clicked for them when they looked back. And part of them looking back was remembering what God had said about what the Messiah would bring. And there's a prophecy in the book of Isaiah where the prophet describes what the Messiah would bring, and he compares it to a party. This is what he says in Isaiah 25. Listen to this. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats, and the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all people, the sheet that covers all nations. What is that? He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. That this first miracle was a taste, a foreshadow of what Jesus came here to bring. That what God wants for all of us is ultimately the chance to connect with him at the ultimate party. The chance that because of the sin that keeps us from him, that Jesus came to remove all those barriers, to swallow up death so that we could experience the deepest sense of joy, the fullest sense of joy that we possibly could. And that's what Jesus came to bring. And I love that we can start to even experience that party now in this life, but actually there is a forward look to it that in the future, God will ultimately redeem and restore everything. And I love how the prophet Zephaniah describes this moment of when death has finally been defeated and we're in this full party mode with God. Heaven and earth have met. And this is what Zephaniah says. It says, the Lord your God in that moment will rejoice over you with singing. Have you ever thought of God as a singer? Like, what style do you think he'd sing? I mean, that's where my brain goes. I have too much time on my hands, but I started thinking, it's like, will he be a rock singer? Would he be a pop star? I know that's terrible, but I started thinking that. I remember I was watching the Olympics, the Winter Olympics opening ceremony, and Andrea Bocelli was singing. And one of the commentators said that a quote that had been said about Andrea Bocelli was that if God had a voice, it would be Andrea Bocelli's. So maybe it will sound like Andrea Bocelli's. I tend to think he's going to be like the lead guitarist with a band of like angels that are rocking out, and he's like rocking a huge solo. Who knows? It could be any number of things. But there's one thing that's for certain, is that God's music style will be joyful. Because that's who he is. And that's what he came to do, for us to experience. And even in Jesus' words, it's why Jesus came to you and I. He came, and this is what he says in John 15, he came so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. And that's my big idea for today, that God is not the joy killer. God is the joy bringer. He wants you to experience the deepest kind of joy. Not only the deepest kind of joy, he wants you to experience his joy and not some cheap counterfeit. You know, as I was preparing for this, I said, you know, at the beginning of this talk that the series design reminded me of my time in a smoothie shop. The series design also reminded me of something else from my childhood a little earlier. Some of you may remember this too. Does anybody remember Fruit Stripe gum? Anybody remember Fruit Stripe gum? Yeah, did you know that they discontinued it 2 years ago? It makes me so sad. Because this was a part of my childhood so much. So, you know, kids, if you're not aware of Fruit Stripe gum, let me educate you just a little bit. So it had this fun, you know, design on it. There's a zebra and there's some, you know, striped on all that. And they would have all sorts of flavors with it. You know, it'd be like lemon and cherry and orange. And a lot of times, for me at least, it was a big temptation when you're going through the checkout line at, you know, at the store, and you're like hoping your mom would let you get some Fruit Stripe gum. So the thing with this gum, and you'll remember this if you tasted it, is that you would put a piece in your mouth, and you know, you would have an immense, tasty taste of lemon or cherry or orange for about 30 seconds. And then after that 30 seconds, what would happen? There would be the nastiest sludge in your mouth that you could ever have. So you'd spit it out. And then what would you do after you spit it out? You put another one in, of course. You know, and so a pack would last somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes long. It was glorious. It was part of our childhood. I can't imagine why they got rid of it. I think that is a great illustration for how most of us tend to experience joy in our life. We buy that car, we go on that vacation, we get that new gadget in our life, food, drink, sex, any of those things that we hope in that moment will lead to joy. And quite honestly, it probably does for a moment. And then it quickly fizzles and falls flat. Even worse, what can happen is that thing can turn from joy into sludge, into discontentment, into frustration. Just ask anybody that owns a boat. Am I right? What Jesus offers us is so much richer and so much deeper. More than momentary happiness. What he wants for us is to experience his joy, the very joy of God. And when you think about the joy that God must have, if he is above all of the different circumstances in our life, if he is the one that created everything, if he is the one that has perfect love, perfect grace, he knows the entire plan from the beginning to the end of what he's going to do, that deep gladness is what he wants you and I to experience all the time, accessible anywhere in our life. But the thing with that kind of joy is that you and I, because it's his joy, we can't manufacture it, we can't generate it, we can't consume our way to it. The only way that we can get it is to receive it. And that's a tricky thing. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about what does it look like if you and I want to open ourselves to receive more of his joy. And as we do that, I want you to picture a sailboat. Not a sailboat you own, you borrowed. That's a lot better than owning one, but picture a sailboat. And you're on this sailboat, and a sailboat can be powered lots of ways. I mean, you could actually row it if you wanted to, but the way that you're actually going to get the most amount of energy, the most amount of forward progress, is when you're able to raise the sails up into the wind. And if the wind is God's joy, it's not a calm sea. It's a gusty wind that's flowing everywhere because God is a God of abundance. And his joy is everywhere. And yours and my job is to simply get ourselves positioned in such a way that we can catch it. And there's a number of ways we can do that. I'm going to highlight 3, but there's many more than the 3 that I have. But here's 3 that might help you start to think about it. The first way we can receive joy is through God's path. I like how the book of Psalms talks about this. This is David, and he says it this way in Psalm 16:11. You make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. You know, what David is saying is that God has not hidden his path from you and I. He wants us to know it. He wants us to understand the way that we can live and that way can actually bring life. I like how the book of Proverbs talks about wisdom, because that's the same thing, about God's wisdom is infused everywhere. The way the Proverbs talk about it is it kind of compares it to like imagining God at the beginning of all time. He has woven into the fabric of existence his very wisdom, his justice, his goodness, his design for flourishing. And so he wants us to know it, but on top of knowing it, he actually wants us, and he says it's for your joy, when you and I align our lives with his path, that's where it leads. You know, Jesus, when he was talking about this, he said it in a similar way. He compared it to a wise man who builds his house on the rock. That's what brings blessing. Blessing is another way to describe a happy life, a joyful life, a blessed life. Those are the good things that God wants for you. But think about it. If someone is building a house, what does it take to build something? It takes intentionality, and it takes a lot of time. Brick by brick, decision by decision, over a period of time. One of my friends, many of you know him. He's a friend, but he's also a mentor in my life. His name is Roland Boyce. Roll Boyce was a pastoral counselor here at this church for many years. He was a chaplain for many years. He's still a good friend. I saw him about a week ago. And so he would meet with a lot of couples who were often in crisis mode when they came to meet with Roll. And he was the perfect person for them to meet with, because their marriages at that moment were far from joyful. And I remember this phrase that he would tell them, because it just stuck with me, where he'd say, and this is meant to be encouraging, but he would say, guys, we did not get here overnight. And so we won't get out of this overnight either. What he was encouraging them with is to say, they're going to start to talk about it. They're going to start to discern what God's wisdom is for their marriage or for their life. And as they start to steer that towards God's path and make decisions, at the moment, it probably won't feel natural. It may not feel pleasurable. They may not describe it as joyful. But what he was encouraging them to do is that with each decision that couple would make, or with each decision you and I make as we build on the foundation of God's path, to think of it like you're raising your sail up and up into God's wind, and that you're experiencing more and more of his joy in your life. That's what happens when we align with his path. A second way that we can receive God's joy is through his purpose. Jesus came, as we know, with the wedding at Cana situation, that he came with a bigger purpose in mind. And this is how the book of Hebrews describes it. And I like the way it's phrased here, because it's a little counterintuitive. It says, this is about Jesus, for the joy set before him, he, Jesus, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. The cross itself, agony, shame, and pain. But what was beyond the cross was resurrection, defeat over sin. In other words, joy. You know, one of our production team members that I love, his name is Josh. He's here today. He was praying before this service, and I loved how he worded it because it connected to this so perfectly. When he was praying, he said, God, on the other side of whatever it is we're going through is victory. And it's that perspective that can change everything with how you and I go through the difficulties that we're in right now, when we know that God's purposes are still going through, and on the other side of whatever room you're in is victory. And in the meantime, what you and I get to do is join in on what God is up to right now. That he is bringing his redemption, his restoration in this world at this time. And some of the greatest ways that you and I can experience joy in this life is when we connect our strengths and our gifts to those greater purposes for what he is up to in the world. And as I was thinking about this, it reminded me of a movie that came out in the 80s called Chariots of Fire. Does anybody remember Chariots of Fire? If you don't remember anything else about the movie, this was what I remember the most, was the guys that are running slow motion while the soundtrack, they're on the beach, you know, it's all those British people, and it's like ding, 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 ding. Anybody remember that? All right, I just feel like I'm just throwing this out there. It's like, I don't know what that is. So there is more to that movie than just the soundtrack. And in fact, the story is an inspiring one. Many of you know the story of a couple of British athletes who persevered through a lot of adversity to win the gold medal during the 1924 Paris Olympics. One of those athletes, his name was Eric Liddell, and he was a devout Christian. He was navigating his faith on the way to the gold medal. But I loved how he worded it in the story. He says this about when he runs. He says, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure." Is there something like that in your life? Where when you do whatever that activity is, you feel God's pleasure. There's a beauty that comes when we've discovered what that is in our life. And there's a joy that comes when we take that and not just use it for ourselves, but connect it to the bigger purposes that God is up to in this world. So if you want to receive his joy, connect your purpose with his purpose. It's a powerful way to do that. Final way I'll mention today is this. That if you want to receive God's joy, you can do it through his presence. The way the psalmist worded it is that, in his presence is the fullness of joy. I was listening to a podcast, an interview with a guy named Steve Cuss. Steve was a former hospital chaplain who is now an organizational leadership expert. He helps churches and pastors think through things. But on this interview, he was talking about his time as a hospital chaplain, which, as you can imagine, is a challenging job, because not only are you dealing with people in difficult situations, but at any moment, a chaplain can be called into a room. It could be in the middle of the night, could be in the middle of a busy day. You can get multiple calls in the middle of it. And so he was recounting that experience, and what he said was profound, because he said, I got to a place where I would start to notice when I had stopped noticing the Lord. Where he could tell that he was just kind of rushing, and he could feel himself, the ways he would word it is that he was getting overly reactive. Like, I'm feeling really annoyed or frustrated, or I can feel myself snapping. And so what he would do, a habit he would have, is that before he would go into a particular room, he would stop and remind himself that the room that he was about to enter, God was already in the room. And it reminds me of the story that we had today, that we looked at, where I imagine at that wedding in Cana, just how many people were there kind of oblivious. Maybe they were oblivious to all the chaos that was actually happening behind the scenes, that they were about to run out of wine and everything was kind of going nuts. But they were also oblivious that the Son of God was somehow at that party in the back of the kitchen, serving up unexpected joy. And so perhaps for you and I, if we want to receive joy in this coming week, the most powerful way we can do that is to try to remind ourselves that God is in the rooms that we're entering in. And I don't know what rooms you're about to enter into this week. Some of them may be routine rooms. Some of them may be mundane ones. Some of them may be chaotic or full of anxiety or stress or big decisions that need to be made. But in that moment, a powerful way for us to do it is to say, okay, God, you are already there, present in this moment. And that sometimes when we notice that we have stopped noticing the Lord, it means that sometimes we miss so much. That there are so many minor miracles that are happening in the rooms that are all around us. It doesn't mean everything's going great, but it can mean that, the laughter of a son or daughter, the taste of good food in my life, the presence of air conditioning, little things that it's like that I just throw away all the time, that those things are great in and of themselves, but actually they are gifts that point to the ultimate source of joy. And that what you and I need to do is to notice that and remember. So as I close today, I want to remind us of the premise of the series that we're in. It's a Fruit of the Spirit series. We're talking about Galatians chapter 5 and what God wants to produce in us. And the reason why I want us to remember that is that God is the one that's producing these things in us, which means that if you and I are finding ourselves at a place today where we're feeling less than joyful, that actually should be a warning sign. that maybe there's a bigger disconnect with him than we would think or would want. Grumpiness is a serious issue. And I'm not talking about momentary frustration or disappointment. I mean, that's life. Like, all of us will have those things in there. I'm talking about when you can tell that grumpiness and dismay have settled into our lives, where the perma-frown is like visible all the time, and you can see the wrinkles in my frown everywhere that I go. And unfortunately, in our culture right now, Christians are known for being grumpy. And that's a big issue because it shows that we're probably not reflecting the God who came to bring the ultimate source of joy. And so my challenge for each of us today is to think of what is one way this week that I can set myself up to be more receptive to his joy. Maybe there's a place in my life where I need to be thinking about how I can get on his path a little bit more. A decision that I know I need to make that maybe doesn't feel right or feel good or feel natural, but it's what God is asking me to do for me or for my relationship. So maybe it's implementing that in your life. Or maybe it's around, his purposes, that you're like, okay, God, I need to either discover what it is that you want me to do, or even in those places where I feel like you're moving in your pleasure, I need to connect that, not for my purposes, but for your purpose. Or maybe it's simply noticing his presence in a way this week. Have a good meal, hang out with some friends. Do something that would cause you to enjoy the pleasures that he's put out in this world as you remember who he is. And one of the ways that you can do that is how we're going to close out today. And that's through a prayer that we're saying throughout this entire series. It's a prayer that's based on Romans 15:13. You can look up that verse afterwards. There's a lot of fruit of the Spirit that's mentioned in there. But this prayer is one that I think is a way to remind ourselves of God's presence, that he is the source of all of this. So I'm going to ask if you stand up with me. And in the spirit of the wedding that happened at Cana, I'm going to do a little pastoral wedding guidance here where I'm going to do a little repeat after me. So I'm going to say a line, and then I want you to say the line after me, and then we're going to go through the prayer. Can we do that? All right, here we go. God of joy, by the power of your Holy Spirit, fill us with your joy so that it will overflow out of us each day and every way in the week ahead. Amen. God bless you all. Thank you.